and politics and issues around that. The Rojamuthiya Research Library has been there for the last 28 years, collecting material related to Tamil studies, more specifically humanities and social sciences, and disseminating this knowledge that's been collected here. We have a solid reference service at the library here, and very happy that these two forums, Rojamuthiya Library and the DPF, jointly have ventured into this idea of creating a space for discussing several ideas. And I invite Suchitra Jain, the author of this book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India. This is a very important book right now. It discusses various issues. I'm happy to invite my colleague, Mr. A.S. Panneerselvan, who heads the Center for Study in Public Sphere of the Rojamuthiya Library, who will be moderating this session. And I invite all of you once again. Please leave your email addresses and phone numbers in case you'd like to be invited for the future programs. Contact one of our staff. You leave your cards, visiting cards, or write down your email and WhatsApp numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sundar. So one of the issues which I keep raising for my students at the National College of Journalism is that India is one country where we have two lines of control or designing of border. One is called the line of actual control on our eastern flank and line of control on the western flank, which means we don't have a settled border. In that sense, we have to start looking at the fluidity of these issues of border. As a journalist, for the first time, I realized the importance of border and the way the border impacts people's imagination was when I was covering Sri Lanka. The fascinating story was that there is a train which connects Jaffna to Colombo. It's called Yardevi Express. And apparently, Yardevi Express used to be carnival list in its journey from Jaffna to Vavuniya. And the moment it crosses Vavuniya and enters Medavachiya, train becomes completely silent. But the silence marks the new boundary. This story resonated in me so much that when I went through this book, I could see various versions of this coming in different parts of the subcontinent. That's one part. And most importantly, in today's context, when citizenship is being subjected to all sorts of manipulation, what happens to people around the border? That becomes a crucial question, and hence this book becomes so important. Before getting to the book, let me give a short introduction to the author. Author is Suchitra Jain. She lives in New York, and she was born and raised in Chennai. She is a writer, lawyer, and a political theorist. She studied law, political science, and international relations. She earlier worked for the UN War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. She co-founded and was the legal director of Resettlement Legal Aid Project, Cairo, that gave legal aid for Iraqi refugees. As a graduate student at Yale, she spent 2 years researching and documenting stories along the contentious Durand Line. In fact, that was her entry into the idea of borders. She was embedded with the ISAF forces, and that gave her an idea of the kinetic terrains in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. She has been working on this book, Midnight Borders, since her graduation from Yale. Her work has appeared in various influential publications such as the Washington Post, the Boston Review, the Hindu, and Foreign Policy. She is an award-winning photographer. She is a founder and the executive director of Police Project, a hybrid research and journalism organization. Thank you, Shra, for coming down.
Can you hear me? Thank you for having me. And it's great because of COVID, when this book came out last year, we haven't had a public event. So this is in some ways the first public event I'm having as a writer, and I'm having it in Madras, Chennai. So I'm absolutely thrilled, and thank you so much for making this possible.
The format is simple. We will have an initial pictorial introduction to the book. Suchitra will use some of the photographs what she had taken for a book as part of a exercise of visiting these border areas. And then she will get into the certain elements of the book, and then we will open up for discussion. So we will start with Suchitra's photographic documentation.
Sure. I just want to make sure that everybody can see this. So this is, I usually start with the cover of the book. And a way to introduce this book is also to introduce a very specific time in which we are writing a book like this as a writer. The book has an India cover and it has a US-UK cover. But there's also certain things about the book as we were putting together that we couldn't do. So before we get into the pictorial or the pictures of the book and why the images are so important to this book, I want to tell you about the images that didn't make the book. Over 8 years, I think I had around 2,000 images that I took as I traveled in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border through India's 8,000, India's over 9,000 mile land border, starting from Bangladesh in the east and ending with Pakistan to the west. But the question is, only 42 images make the book, 42 images in the US, and 41 images in India. There are other things that didn't make the book, and that is also maps. One of the themes that constantly kept emerging as I traveled, whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was the Turkum borders, whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was India, whether it was Nagaland, that people actually in these areas made their own maps. People always made their own maps. Whether it was, of course, the most famous ones that is now almost called anti-national is the map of Khalistan. But even the Khalistan versions of the map were very different. In Nagaland, people had their own version of the map. In Kashmir, people had their own version of the map. Surprisingly, there's also a map of what Tamil Nadu would be if Tamil Nadu had actually become, so people have always been drawing these different maps. But we couldn't put those maps in the book because there are laws in this country that tell us that certain kinds of maps are not allowed. Another question that people always ask me about this book is that why does this book not have the current map? And the reason I made a very conscious choice not to have the current map is because for a lot of people, the map of India that is very familiar to you and me, even yesterday my mom was saying Kashmir to Kanyakumari as if it is taken for granted. That map that is so familiar to you and me is not the map that many people actually believe is a map that they can live with. So to even have that map in the book felt very, very violent. So we didn't start with that map. So another image that, as I said, the book also has 42 images in the US and 41 images here. Also understand that our 8 years, what you see in this book is a fraction of things that came together. This book manuscript was due in November 2019. And the few months leading up to the book just fell apart. We had the Babri Masjid decision. We had Article 370 revoked in Kashmir. We had the CA NRC. And so many people who were part of this book actually no longer wanted to be a part of this book because it became unsafe for them to be a part of it. And because this book was written not as a journalist, but as someone who was trying to make sense of India, I let many of these stories. For instance, the book does not have a Gujarat chapter. Not because I didn't go to Gujarat, simply because almost everybody who was part of that chapter no longer wanted to be a part of this book. it was too unsafe for them, or they felt that their names being out would no longer be a place for them to tell their stories. And early on in the book, I say that my job is not to bear witness. I'm not a storyteller. My job is to critique the power of a very violent nation state. So when people no longer wanted their stories to be told, we let those stories go. I let those stories go. I also wanted this book to have, over 8 years, in addition to the travel, in addition to the images I gathered, maps that are not in this book, I also had a lot of paper cuttings, which I will show towards the end of the presentation. So in some ways, I really wanted this to be some kind of a pamphlet. But then my editors, both my editors stepped in and said, Suchitra, this book is already so heavy. Do not add more. That's why even the sentences, when you read the book, we try to keep the sentences and everything else really tight. And the reason that the India book has one photograph less is because, again, kind of going back to the idea that no one person writes a book is an act of community. The US book went to press first, and my India editor Ajita said, it didn't strike me. She said in one of the stories, we had the name of the person, their village, and their photograph. And my editor said, Suchitra, what happens if this person becomes identifiable? And these are people whose lives have already been deeply affected by the CA, NRC, not to mention the violence of the foreigners' tribunals. So at that point in time, the India book, we removed the image. So we had the permission, the person had agreed, but we just felt we were not sure anymore. And the reason I'm giving, though this was supposed to be about the images, the reason I'm giving this very long introduction is that a book and a writer is very much a part of our time. Just as much as we can write, and I think even more important the time that we live in, to remember the things that we cannot write, the stories that did not make it. The image we thought was no longer safe because the person who told their story, we didn't know if their story being printed along with their image was going to be safe for them anymore. What if someone went looking for them? What is the ethical job of a writer to put, maybe the person would not have been at risk. So that's how the book itself came together. What I'm going to do is kind of I'm going to start with the book. So this is how the book opens. This is the first page of the book. And this is an important moment in the book for me and also in the journey, because I think this was when this image was taken in Paktika province in Afghanistan. I was embedded with the US forces in Afghanistan-Pakistan border. I was embedded in the US military. And when I first went there, I was doing research on insurgency in the border areas. The question I went there was very different. I didn't go there to do research on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. I went there with a question as a graduate student. My question was twofold. One, what had happened to the $13 trillion that the US had spent in the name of war on terror in Afghanistan and Pakistan? Second, I also wanted to understand the way in which images were produced of the war on terror and 9/11. And one of the first things that became very clear to me when I got to Afghanistan was that 9/11 happened when I was 17 years old. And when I got to Afghanistan 10 years later, I had seen enough images of what Afghanistan looked like. When you all go home, you can take your phone and do a Google search, or you can do it now, of Afghanistan and war on terror. What you will find for the next 5 pages are images of US Army in a yellowish brown terrain. Over and over again, you will see images of the American soldiers. Sometimes you will see a hawk flying behind. Sometimes you will see them giving, ice creams or chocolates, or trying to be, they called it the counterinsurgency policy of winning the hearts and minds. But you never really saw what happened to Afghans. You never really saw images like this. This image was taken from an important command point overlooking the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. From where I was standing, I was told that this is where Afghanistan ended and this is where Pakistan started. Honestly, I didn't know where Afghanistan ended and where Pakistan started. And I don't think the new imperial army at least the Imperial Army, the US Imperial Army that was there knew where Afghanistan ended and Pakistan started. And in some ways, it was Afghanistan. In spending in these times, I realized that so much of what was happening about the world, whether it was the violence, whether it was question of citizenship, all of it was tied to the idea of borders, of nation states, and what does it mean to think about citizenship. And when I was leaving, I think I was also trying to understand what the local Afghans were being recruited to fight a war that none of them signed up to fight. And this is what Commander Mahmoud told me. He said, it's a colonizer's map. They had no respect for our land. Why should we respect their borders? Surprisingly, this sentiment is not just Commander Mahmoud's sentiment. This is also the sentiments of millions of people that we claim to be Indian, but have always never given them the right or the respect or the dignity or the freedom. Many of them for over 50 years have lived with draconian laws like us, who do not think of us as a nation, but think of the mainland as a colonizer. So I think it's very important for us to understand that not all of us view what we think is home the way that others do. And this is how the book starts. Who is the colonizer and whose map? And whose map do people respect? And these today, in this time and day, I know that these kinds of questions, even asking about them, asking you to think about them, can be an act of sedition. And that's why I say a writer is always writing, and a book is always a function of where we are in time. But from Afghanistan, one of the things that I told myself was that by then I had lived away from India. I had left when I was 17. I was not a South Asianist by training. I had worked as a lawyer. A lot of the work I had done had to do with understanding war crimes in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, having looked at refugee crisis in the Middle East. I felt I knew more about the world than I knew about the country that enclosed my home. And my first thing was I was finishing up graduate school. I had a great job where I would go on to do other things. And I said to myself, what would I find if I traveled India's land border? I thought this would take a few months. I thought this would be a photographic project and it would be done. But it didn't. In some ways, it fundamentally remade my life. It changed what I would do with my life. And it also took me 8 years to travel the 9,000-mile border. And the map guide was the map, meaning for the Borderlands project in 2001. Very cool. I mean, think about it. As a writer, you realize that you grow and you realize sometimes in Tamil, there's a word called Arave card. So now when I go back and think about it, it feels how incomplete my own ideas were about borders and citizenship. Not that I have a much better idea now, but I genuinely feel that there's much for us to learn and think about. My sister actually mocked up the map for me. Green was already the place that I had traveled. And my grand ambition when I came back from the first leg of the travel was that I would travel the blue and finish it. Little did I know that I was not going to be able to actually do the entire line, because the moment you get to places like Kashmir and you get to the western border, it's impossible for you to trace a line. It's not like the India-Bangla border, which is a little bit more full. And the other map that you will find in the book, the one that my sister, more of a nostalgia to show you where the idea was when it started. Other map that you have here, India might be split up, is also an important reminder for us. What we think now has home, what we think is for granted, is actually not what was it. The map that we have today could have been very different. If you look at the Partition Archives, one of the things that you find out was that initially Lahore was supposed to be given to India, but they'd already given Calcutta, so they were, Pakistan would then not have a big metropolis or a thriving city. So the question was that who would Lahore go to? Lahore could have, for all purposes, come to India. Lahore, that is now very much a very Pakistani city for many of us, could have been in India. So what did we get in return, or what? I'm going to I'm also going back to this idea of language of what did we. So what did India, the nation state, get in return for Lahore? We got the district of Gurdaspur. Gurdaspur is what gives the Indian nation state the direct land access to Kashmir. I'm going to walk you through some of the images in the book, some that are not in the book and some there are. This is an important image for me. Another thing about the book is that initially this was supposed to be a photographic project. When I got to Afghanistan, I wasn't very comfortable with the research practices that so many of us were employing to study these regions. I felt the research process itself was very violent, it was imperial. While now some of us were brown, who had some similar privileges, who could travel, I felt that we were replicating the same mistakes that for what imperial ethnographers and anthropologists had been doing for long. So I became very uncomfortable with the way in which I was also using my own research skills. I became very uncomfortable about how does one write about a place like this. So an easy way to get around not facing the realities of writing, because a writer has to be very brave, you know. A good writer is a brave writer because to be a brave writer, you have to record what you see in front of you. And I don't think I had the courage to even understand or interpret or even write it down. So a good way to get away from writing is also to take images. So I thought I would take images. This would be a visual documentation. It would be other people's poetry. So in Afghanistan, I started taking images. That way I felt the image could be a testimony. Very soon I would find out that images also have their limitations. And what you find in Afghanistan is not a story of imperial conquest. It's not a story of empire's graveyard. What you really see is a people for over, depending on where you start the timeline, trying to fight for rights and dignity and their capacity to rule themselves, which they've never been given. And that story will repeating itself over and over. Theme that was very common. This is again in Pakistan border. Again, I urge all of you to go home and look up Afghanistan War on Terror. You will never find images like this. This is a local Afghan army person trying to guard a checkpoint. This is not a checkpoint that is resourced. If you see, it only has a barrel. It doesn't even have an actual gun. So in reality, if the Taliban actually attacks this post, these poor men are actually going to die. So what you really have is not resources, but this is exactly what war looks like. And it's also important for us to remember that when you hear the word, look what our soldiers are doing in the border, this is what our soldiers are doing in the border. What they're really doing is that actually in war, a lot of war is just waiting around with no resources, where you send the communities most vulnerable to go fight a battle that you would never go fight yourself. And I saw this over and over again in Afghanistan. In some ways, if I hadn't seen it there, and I don't think I would have been able to recognize this as I traveled through it. Again, another important, which point. This is actually, the actual command point is important because the Americans had lost about 200 people trying to get this Gulradin post. The Gulradin post was important because it overlooked an important road called the Route G, which was the way in which all of the transportation and trucking went through all the way from Afghanistan in the bottom, all the way up to the Pashtunkhwa regions. So this was important. And yet what you saw over and over again in the war, the Afghans were given these beaten up trucks. They didn't get the missionary, they didn't get your Hawks, they didn't get the American Empire's great weapons. What they got was every day you would see the local Afghan soldier fighting with the American soldier for 5 liters of petrol to be able to, do with the petrol. So another thing you realize early on is that the mysteries of the war on terror is not a brave American soldier parachuting down into a terrain. This was what war looked like. And in the book, again, we couldn't put all of the images. The way we again put this book together is that the book has no captions. The images become a part of the book. This is again Commander Mahmood, the day that I left Afghanistan. This was when they were making the last meal for me. And in some ways, we had to struggle to figure out what images would go in. And this is how we kind of picked images. We chose mostly people, and places where it became difficult to have people, then we kind of had to let it go. This is another story that again is very important for me in the book, because this is one of the kids. So when I was in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, what they were doing is that by 10 years' time, the war in Afghanistan had already come to a point of fatigue. Americans were recruiting the local boys, mostly young boys, and they would train them for a week, give them $100 and AK-47, and then sent them off to fight the Taliban. Often the boys joined these things not because they understood what was happening. They joined these things because $100 was more than what they could see. This image, if you look at this, he has a M&M in his hand. This is a child. And this boy didn't make it. By the time the summer came, I was there during their training. The next summer, when I called back, this boy was already dead. And you see this over and over again in terms of what happens, but also what happens to the people who live in these border areas. This is the Turkum border crossing, where you see people regularly traveling back and forth between the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. I realize that the amount of displacement that happens in South Asia, I don't think we understand how many people and their lives have been consistently displaced. Not by choice. Some of us have the privilege of traveling. You know, we can choose when we travel. We have a document that says what our name is, but we don't. Another theme that runs regularly through the book is this idea that we don't understand the extent to which people have to leave. And often when they leave, they're not leaving because they are thieves. They're not leaving because they're criminal. They're not illegal. They're leaving for a better life. Some of us, when we leave for a better life, we can come back as Sundar Pichais. Some of us do not get that. But the difference in the world is that while we encourage a certain kind of migration, other kinds of migration are called illegal, criminal. And one of the things that I really wanted to not preach, but through the stories tell in the book, is that wanting to live with human dignity and a certain kind of freedom is never illegal. And I think that's one of the things that I hope that now us to the end of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And as I said, the book starts with the Afghanistan-Pakistan border because it gives you a sense of why this entire book started. This is the first leg of travel that I did in 2013. It's an interesting travel because in Afghanistan, along the Bangladesh border, you actually travel. You can travel and trace the line, but you can't do this once you leave this part of the world. Once you go to the other borders, it almost becomes impossible. This is, again, not in the book, but I always found this to be, this is from the CIA archives that were recently made available in 2000, I think 2015. And what is very interesting about this is these are cables that are sent from the desk in India, where this is what the Americans think the Indian border miles are. And there's a very interesting paragraph in the dispatch where they say, where the person writing this says, I have my doubts if the Indians will ever agree to any unclarified version of their boundary positions at this time. But we will still intend to give them the chance to say no. And again, what they're really trying to say is that it's impossible for us even today to actually tell us where the Indian border begins and where the Indian border ends. I know it sounds very crazy for a lot of us because it was also very crazy for me to understand that, because growing up, I think one of the first images of Kashmir came to me as a very young person with the image of the film Mani Ratnam's film Roja. Throughout the years, we've seen so many films where we are told that this border is sacrosanct. We are told that we know where the border begins and where the border ends. But in reality, that is not the case. The Indian state in its various documents cannot agree. Forget anybody else. The Indian state, the Pakistani state, the Bangladeshi state, in Burma, and all of these places, none of these South Asian nation states for their own records can agree where their own territorial sovereignty begins and ends. And one of the stories that I always like telling is that border security guards who are sent to guard our borders often do not know where the border begins and border ends. Often they themselves will find themselves on the other side because of a fog, and they would have to be returned back. So this is where the book starts. This is India's border pillar number 1. So this is how our border pillar number 1 looks. And actually the boys in both sides of the village use this as a border pillar. They use this as a wicket. No, what you're seeing is an international game of cricket between India and Bangladesh. But this is how the border looks. But there is actually no border in the real sense because people move. right? People move around very easily. Sometimes they're allowed to move, sometimes they are penalized. Everybody in the border area has two SIMs because you will get, the Indian SIM and you have the Bangla SIM. You will have Indian Kola and you'll have the Bangla Kola. Interestingly, the first time when I was here, every time I would go to these places, the first thing that would happen is that they would always come and give you things to eat. If it's not tea, then it would be cola. And one of the first trips, I still had a border security guard standing with me. And when they got me a cola, the guard tells me, "Oh, this is Bangla cola. You're anti-national. Go get her Indian cola." But you realize that these constant conversations actually consistently militate what happens in these border areas. Again, some of the instances of what it looks. But the most interesting things is that as you grow up in Malda, you will still find border pillars that say East Pakistan. Some border pillars are lost. Some of them are in people's backyards. Half the time you will find clothes hanging here. Again, what these things do over and over again is really militate the idea of what we do with the border. Of course, the once porous border is now being increasingly electrified. As you can see, the fences are now coming up. I think almost 80% of the fence is done. And it's not as fortified as the India-Pakistan border and other borders, but you can see how militarization is completely remaking these places. Again, the person walking in the middle, the right side of the image is India and the left side of the image is Bangladesh. And these are all villages caught in between. Of course, there are homes in which the international border runs, which means that somebody's house, if they cross their house, you would be in a different country. And what's incredibly problematic in all of this is that it's not just a story, right? It's not just one anecdote. Right? Who do these people belong to is not just a question of belonging and rights and dignity, but also who gets to police these people. Also, you have to understand that majority of the border areas in the India-Bangla border happens to be predominantly Muslim, and then followed by landless Dalit Bahujan communities, which means that they also become the disproportionately policed, surveilled, and become the victims of the violence of both sides, whether it's the Bangla Border Security Force or the Indian Border Security. This is again the same village. Again, as you see that in all of these villages over the years, you realize that what was once a lush farming community is being destroyed. One, of course, is climate change, which is completely remaking these spaces. Second, militarization and border fencing means that large swaths of swamps are being reclaimed to build these things. So your security fences are not only militarizing the area, they're also they're also places that are environmentally deeply problematic. What you really see over and over again is loss of livelihood. People keep losing their livelihood. They lose it because of climate change. They lose it because of violence. They lose it because they can no longer farm their land. The water no longer brings you the fish. So what do people do? And one of the stories that you will constantly keep hearing over and over again in the book is that people leave and they migrate. Often in the act of migration, they lose their documentation. Every time there is a rain, when you go to these parts of the world, you will find an old gentleman sitting by the corner trying to dry his ID document. Because that ID document is the only thing that makes him, gives him some identification. He has no land. The land is either underwater or he's moved because of violence. Without his ID document, he could be called an illegal. He could be sent away. And often even the capacity to have an ID card, even in a time at which the Indian government actually is giving out ID cards for cows. We don't have those who have lived within what is the territorial limit of India. They do not possess identification that can actually claim who they are. So these are again images from Tawang and other places. Again, once you go and you spend time in Arunachal Pradesh and all of these communities, what you really see is a consistent resistance from many of the monks who have lived there for long. They have a sense of resistance against what's happening. In all of India's border areas, one thing that is happening over and over again is the question of militarization, climate change, and along with it, reclamation of land. the army and the border security force often they confiscate huge swaths of land and they build structures that are environmentally damaging. And I was very surprised when I first went to Tawang, when I started doing this project, is that the story was not just about the Chinese incursion. The story was not just the Chinese coming in. The story was that of how the idea, the rhetoric of development hadn't actually reached any of these places, how people regularly spoke about corruption, but more importantly, people spoke regularly of fighting the state, fighting the local state, because they were fighting for environmental rights. They were constantly fighting against building of dams, they were fighting against acquisition of lands. And the story that never got told to a larger audience was that Tibetan monks are very much part of a huge resistance where they consistently protest. At the same time, they're also so deeply dependent on the military to bring them the services, right? It takes you almost 2.5 days to go from drive. It took me 2.5 days to drive from Dimapur all the way to Tawang. What should be a 4-hour or a 5-hour journey takes you 2 days. And it's by design. It's not just a question of corruption, but it's also by design that you're keeping these regions. So those who live in these spaces, imagine taking 2 days to just leave a city. What should take you 4 hours, taking you 2 days? Second is also the ways in which we think about these landscapes. One of the things that I learned while I was traveling is that what you see in the visuals that whether it's in cinema, whether it is in reporting, all of these spaces consistently militate your idea of what a border is, right? Because right behind this is China. These are regions that both India and China claim as their own, but nobody really knows where, again, India begins and China ends. So again, these are images from the region. This is an image that actually didn't make the book. And this is a story of ecocide. One of the stories I wish had more presence in the book is the story of environmental damage. So what you really see is this stunning place is actually what happened is when the ground basically is opened up because of consistent logging. And what you see is that the earth has split. And now what you see is that the land that is split has become along with these dead trees. So these are dead trees, and then what you have, well, this looks like a stunning image. What you really see is a story of ecocide. A border is not just about fighting some kind of an imaginary enemy who, could be someone else, someone we are constantly fighting. The enemy also that we are not taking care of the landscapes. We're not taking care of the region in a way it should be. Because what we don't realize is that climate change is already here. What army will you stand to guard your borders when ocean has already swallowed up your home? Especially for a place like Chennai, we are already under the coastline. So imagine in a few years, a lot of our homes that we know in our lifetime is not going to be where we are. We already have over 2 million climate change refugees within South Asia. So how are we going? What rights do these people have? Once the ocean, once anything else that climate change does is going to take over. Also part of the border story is not just the freedom and dignity, but also the story of what is going on climate change, and especially people most affected by climate change. These are images from the story, the massacre in Delhi and in Assam. And these are hard stories to tell because this is a story in which the person that I spoke to was a person who ended up burying all the children from the massacre. And this is a story of memorialization where how do you tell a story in which not only were people slaughtered, including children. So Nobin Hussain, who's in the book, talks about running for help and not getting it and coming back home to see his entire family killed, including his young nieces. The tree that you see here is what he points out to. He says, we also bury people there. And the reality is that in places like this, there are no memorials for people who died of these things. So how do you again tell these stories without making this a trauma porn, right? It becomes very easy for a writer to say, okay, this person died, that person died, 5,000 people were killed. But what then? What comes after you tell someone's trauma? Also, how do you depict a person's trauma? And the photograph that you see on the top, this is from the book, is where Nobin Hussain is right behind him. To the left is where they buried over 200 children. And as you see, he's standing on the ground where he buried those children, right? So what you really see is that the history of borders in India, or history of borders in all of South Asia, is also a story of communities constantly fighting violence. They're fighting a kind of violence that happens so often that there is no sense of justice. There is no sense to understand what happens. There is a line in the book where the photographer who photographed the massacre is there. He's one of the only few photographers who's there on the site. He sees the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi come in, and she basically is very surprised that there's a photographer. Her biggest concern, he says, was that there was a photographer present to document something. Her concern was not that so many people had been killed. And there's an incredible line in that book. The photographer I'm talking about is Bhavan Singh. So Bhavan Singh won the World Press Photograph for documenting the Delhi massacre. And when I interviewed Bhavan Singh, he says, I saw some of the most powerful people in the country who could have done something to help these people, save these people, and they never did it. He, of course, was talking about Indira Gandhi back then, repeated over and over and over again in the book. Some of the most powerful people in this country who could have done something have failed or abdicated their responsibility to not only bring freedom and dignity to these people, but have consistently denied and have been the roadblock for these people getting any kind of. One of the very few images where we have a photograph of someone stating directly, this Abeham, she is someone who was born and raised here, but she was picked up as a doubtful voter when she was a few months pregnant. She had documentation that said where she went to school, she was married, she was born and raised here. Her grandfather was a freedom fighter. But because her name was spelled differently in one document and the other, and the lawyer that they had hired to be the spokesperson for these foreigners tribunal never really informed them. One day they go to the court to find out what is the status of a doubtful voter case in the foreigners tribunal, and the police round her up and say, you've been declared a foreigner. And then Rashminara was 4 months pregnant. She was in prison throughout the entire pregnancy. And then because of local groups had come out and she could find of a local politician, and this was moved to the Supreme Court, that she has been out. She's been out for about 2 years now. But there is no resolution. Anytime Rashminara Beham could go back. Because she'd already been photographed, when I had met her, she'd already been photographed by Amnesty International. We asked her if we could photograph her with her children. And the little child in her hand is a child that was born in detention. One of the few instances in the book where we actually have a person's image here, because this image was already out, and then we wanted to make sure that we could take a photograph. Otherwise, most of these images in the book are not direct. One is to protect the identity of the people, but also for me as a photographer first, because as I said, this book began as a photography project. I didn't intend to write this book as a lawyer or a researcher or a theorist. I intended to write this book as a photographer. And I very quickly realized that photographs would not be enough. And of course, the legal language would not work. So in some ways, this book taught me to be a writer, because I've always been afraid to be a writer. To be a writer is very different than to be a researcher, to be a lawyer. So even as the images became more and more, it became impossible for me to take the same kind of images. The images where you jump into someone's home, put a camera in front of them, take a photograph of them and say, look, I have documented this story. And also I had to start thinking, if I was going through this, would I allow someone to come into my house and take a photograph of me when I was the most vulnerable? So there's also one of the few instances in the book where you actually see somebody directly looking at me or at the mirror. A lot of the other images are either not there or we chose not to have these images. Once, as I said, the images became insufficient. And language also becomes insufficient to write a book like this. What we did in this book was that we created this table called Death by Citizenship. And I had a wonderful researcher, Mariam Raza, who helped me put together. This list was up to date till the book went to print. We actually put the list of all the people who had died as a result of being held in these prisons, or these were people who had documents but were picked up by the Foreigners Tribunal. And again, all of them held in these places, they passed away. So we have different reasons. Some of them were suicides. This is just a, we had, I think there are 5 pages. And we also made a very active choice to put this list of people who passed away, death by citizenship, right in the middle of the book. This is not an appendix. So we had to find different ways of telling a story. A list is an important thing, right? A list is always an important way of telling a story. Another thing that I also found, whether it was Yugoslavia, whether it was Kosovo, whether it was Rwanda, whether it was my Iraqi clients, whether it was my clients who had formerly been part of the Sudanese liberation movement, all of them had lists. They all had lists of people, their comrades that they had lost. So this, keeping a list right in the heart of the book as a way for us to realize that not only memorializing these people, because a lot of these names don't even appear. Another thing that I found as we were doing this research was that half the time when people reported this, they got their names wrong. When people died, we didn't even get their names wrong. So make sure that we got their names right. Of course, this is not up to date. So we also had to find ways of telling stories, and lists were important. This brings us to Kashmir. Again, if you see the way this image doesn't make the book, but the way I shot these images was that I didn't want people to be identified. And the way it was lit and shot was to make sure that I wanted to protect the people, because I no longer knew how safe it was for people to talk. I mean, we are in a world where they are picking up comedians for arresting comedians under sedition laws for the jokes that they never said. Families that have been, members have been disappeared. Kashmir is much larger. It's a story, it's a disappearance, but it's also a story that is much longer. Photograph that I took with one of the families that I spoke to, again, here in the book. What you see on the other side is a death telegram. This is from the Kashmir archives. And again, another interesting thing is that just as a lot of the Kashmiri news portals are now being scrubbed off the internet, these are archives from the early 80s and 90s when the insurgency again started in Kashmir. I think a lot of these archives, when I went there, I think we photocopied and scanned over 8,000 pages or 9,000 pages. These archives are no longer there anymore because the entire journalist colony has been shut down. So beyond these scans, I don't even know if we have these images or these archives anymore, because they're also systematically scrubbing off anything that is, this happens in Manipur and Nagaland as well. So what you see here is that in the height of the insurgency, because so many young boys were picked up and never came back home, parents would buy newspapers and all you would get are photographs of the dead. So what you're really seeing on the other side is a death telegram from the 90s, where literally they would just put a photograph from the forensic department of the young boys who were picked up and disappeared. And again, these were not boys who, not that you kill boys who cross over. These were not boys who were fighting. These were literally young Kashmiri boys who were picked up from downtown Srinagar and disappeared and shot dead on the street. Mirza Wahid talks about in his book of what it meant to grow up in 90s Kashmir, where you would walk down the street and just see dead bodies piled up. And this is how families found out that their boys had died. They would go pick up their local newspaper to find out. Surprisingly, much hasn't changed. And it's very important for us to think about how we think about these things. This was also, we couldn't put this, this is also not in the book, because we didn't know. We didn't know if we could put this in the book. We didn't know what would happen. And we chose not to put this in the book. But this is something that I regularly talk about. This is described in the book, but we didn't put the images in the book. This is, again, an image of Uri all of you will know Uri from the film, but this is Uri. This is in the border village Uri when I was staying with a family. What you see outside the window is again is the line of control is just literally few feet away from where we are. Uri is interesting because in 2000, when the first earthquakes happened in early 2000s, is when a lot of people from Srinagar, including Puram Parvez, who was a member of JKCCS, who was recently picked up under sedition charges, started going to Uri in the early 2000s. For the first time, even those in Srinagar come to realize that they were actually mass graves of young boys in these places. Uri again is a story of, by the time I got to Uri, within 5 minutes, the local police officer knew who I was. He wanted me to come in. And you realize the extent of surveillance, how much these people are survived. And it's a very different thing. I don't think these are stories one can tell unless one actually experiences it. Sometimes you also get a chill in the back of your back because you just don't know where you're going. Again, these are images from the bunkers. I also chose not to put one of the reviewers for the New Indian Express said, called me a silly girl and said, this girl doesn't know what happened in the borders, and she does not respect our soldiers. The reality is that when I started talking about this, and as I spoke about the soldiers and the young men in Afghanistan who are going to fight, a lot of soldiering is waiting around and doing nothing, fighting the battles that we never signed up for. But also, this was not the story that I was going to tell. I was not telling the state story. I was not going to be the narrative of the state. So these are some of the things that I actually wanted in the book, but doesn't appear in the book. Story of someone who's 102 years old. How does someone who was older than the nation states of South Asia prove where they belong to? And I think this is something that you see in the chapter in Myanmar, where the Myanmar chapter starts with the story of a young Rohingya refugee who was in Assam, who was held in Assam for over 12 years for illegally crossing the border. He's not supposed to have been held for more than a year, but he ends up spending 12 years. And I found him when he was trying to smuggle a letter out. So when I try to tell Amir Hakim's story, you realize that what happened in Myanmar, how systematically people's identities were removed, you realize that manufacturing statelessness has been going on in South Asia for a really long time. And much of it is also right now happening within the borders of India. Another one of these is also, just looking at how many people were left out and how much money was spent. And I think there's another wonderful book I would urge all of you to really pick up and read is Rajshekhar's Despite the State. It's a brilliant book because he talks about how a democracy decays. And, he kind of shoots down the false gods of development and democracy. That we are constantly pitting democracy and development with each other without really understanding what democracy is. And this is one of my favorite stories of a runaway grandmother. And I'll end with this. And these are some of the archives that I wanted. I also had prints of these, and we couldn't put this in the book. I wanted some of these archives also to come to the book, but we didn't put it in the book. But these stories are actually interesting because people are constantly militating against the idea of a border. No matter how militarized it is, no matter how many fences you put, how strong these fences are, how many border guards you put it, people will constantly militate against it because the border is not the most natural way for us or how we believe and build community. So I'll end with that.
There are two things. One is the international border and one is this LOC. What is the difference you notice when you are traveling between the international border and the LOC?
So the thing with India's international border is that the border actually doesn't begin where we think the border begins. To travel along the India-Bangladesh border, we have a border. Encampments actually start 15 meters inside. Here, That's fencing the borders 15 meters in. No? So what of and land? India and Bangladesh agreed that they would initially India and Bangladesh agreed that there would not be any fittings, there would not be any kind of fixtures that define the border. But of course, India started building its border. But once you leave this and go to so you have the line of actual control and then you have the line of control. The line of control is, you can't reach line of control. The line of control is severely militarized. Often the line of control, you can only maybe go to say a few kilometers, especially in places like Kashmir, it's only a few kilometers. In other places, what you really see is that the military would often cordon off entire villages that are around. And those entire villages in some ways will become the de facto line of control. So what you really see over and over again is that, again, I'm making generalizations. And one of the things about the Indian border, whether it's international border, whether it's line of control, line of actual control, is that everything changes every 100 feet. And there is no one way to say that this is how an ID will look or this is our line of control looks. Because various parts of the line of control is under the command of a very different kind of an officer. There is not just one kind of an officer who looks after it, right? You have the border security force, you have the army, you have the local police sometimes, you have the border police. So each part, it's like a bit of a puzzle that each border takes. In parts of Rajasthan, you will actually have the local IAS, IPS officers, administrative officers responsible for the space. So in reality, the management of India's borders is impossible to say this is how this works and this is how it doesn't work. So that's how at least that was my experience of how these various borders that we think of exist and are policed, surveilled. It changes every 100 feet.
During the Agra summit, immediately following Agra summit, Manmohan Singh and Musharraf back-channel negotiations, they came up with one idea that borders are there to stay, but can we make it irrelevant? Can we make these things move through it? And in fact, 2 zero papers were produced on that. Nothing happened because Musharraf lost power first, and then Manmohan Singh lost, and that idea died. How do people look at this entire debate of two leaders of the nation state saying that can we make these borders irrelevant?
Which people?
People around that area, if they knew whether that such a debate was happening.
No. Again, it's what people were worried about on a day-to-day basis was the loss of their home. All of them, whether it was the India-Bangla border, whether it was Kashmir, whether it was Faisalka, no matter where. Let me give you a bunch of examples. The biggest concern for almost everybody who lived along the India-Bangla border, which was still part 4, is beginning to get militarized, was that their families who were just across the river were getting cut off. They could no longer even, before you could cross the river and then your aunt's house was there. Now that was impossible. So they were worried about that. There were women. Another story that appears in the book is a story of a lot of these women from these villages in Bangladesh who travel all the way to get married. Some travel all the way across to Gujarat. So the question is, once you travel, how do you go back home? How do you maintain those relationships? Because as I said, one of the archives says, how does a 102-year-old woman prove her citizenship when she's older than the nations? Once you went to places like the conclaves and exclaves, you realize that people didn't even know where they belonged. They needed something as simple as an ID in order for them to get the basic services. In other places, access to schools were becoming difficult because they were fencing everything. So as a young girl, if you had to go to school, you had to travel across 5 border posts to get to school. And families no longer wanted to send their young girls because, you didn't want these young girls to cross through these borders with all of these men in these uniforms. Sexual violence was an issue. In Rajasthan, of course, was the question of landmines. When when Project Parakram was started, when India and Pakistan were in this huge standoff phase, India laid one of the largest land mining projects. An entire agrarian grounds were cleared to lay land mines. When Pokhran happened, the entire village there was severely affected. So in those cases, people were fighting to get their lands back. People were fighting to get access to their lands. Of course, in Kashmir, it is in Kashmir, Manipur, the Nagaland, it is not just that, it's also dealing with histories of violence. So people were not thinking about these larger grand narratives. They didn't care what Musharraf or Manmohan Singh were talking about. They really cared about the basic everything. How am I going to survive? What am I going to do? Because livelihood had become so difficult, people were beginning to. It'll be very interesting. Once I said, "What do you guys smuggle?" He said, "Oh, we smuggle chilies, we smuggle coffee syrup, we smuggle saris." So people were smuggling these little things in order to survive, to make a little bit more. So no, I don't think people were thinking about Musharraf or Manmohan Singh. They were thinking about IDs, they were thinking about their food, they were thinking about how to get access to their land. They were thinking what happens if a border post comes here and then, what happens to my teenage daughter who has to cross. So no, people were not thinking about this.
One of the interesting thing is there is a chapter on Nelly. And Nelly is technically not a border by any stretch of the imagination. Why did you choose Nelly in a book which deals with border? And what is the metaphorical significance of it?
So two things. One, every person that I came to Nelly much later, uh, towards the last leg of my travel. But almost everybody, I spent about 2.5 years, almost 2.5 years during the Assam work. And I was doing the Assam field work before Assam became news, before the NRC and CA became, this was when people were beginning to kind of wake up to a reality. Almost everybody I spoke to spoke of little massacres and riots. Every family history of migration, history of moving within these various IDP camps started with a history of violence. And Nelly was one of it. A lot of communities after Nelly migrated because they no longer felt it was safe to live there. Or there were people who had seen the massacres. There were people who had survived the massacre. People whose grandfathers' bodies had floated down the river. So in some ways, Nelly just kept coming over and over and over again. And again, it's one of those, when you say in Tamil Nadu, you say Chidambara Ragasya, right? It's one of those things where everybody knows what happened, but nobody talks about it. There was an official report that was published, but a handful of people have seen it. Maybe a few journalists over the years have had access to it, but nobody has really seen the actual report. The government has a different number of deaths, the people have a different number of deaths. And of course, there's been no sense of justice to those who were massacred. Some people say that those who were killed were illegal Bangladeshis, as if someone being illegal itself is a reason to massacre them. So that story of this violence then creating multiple acts of violence, people migrating just kept coming over and over again. And by the time I had also finished doing my own field work, I realized that borders were not just the land borders. There were other kinds of borders that were already being created internally. Borders were, my body had become a border. People's right to dignity had become a border. And another thing that was important was that there was another story of another very violent massacre that never got told. And those that I spoke to no longer wanted to be a part of this. And these two massacres also connected. And my way of trying to make sense of this is that how does one tell a story of impunity that happened almost 35 years ago, but also how does one try to connect it to the present? Because history is not linear. History is messy. History of how people think about violence is. So in that sense, the Nelly chapter came much later. It was not the chapter that was not how I imagined the book, but in some ways, it just made. Sometimes a book makes way for other things, and the book made way for that chapter.
I think we should open up for questions and the participants. questions, please. Please introduce yourself.
Sarah. I was just listening to your last question and the last answer, and I thought it was a very. I was waiting for you to say that there are many areas where there are borders, not just your national border. And I think that's very correct because what happens with these massacres that you're clearing the ground. When you clear the ground or you create new differences between people or tensions between people, then you're like taking territory. You're creating something new in that space, right? And that I think that is the way that we should be thinking about borders as a difference between us, both internally and at the external border of the country. So I appreciate your answer to that.
Thank you, sir.
Just making an observation. I was just thinking while you were speaking that in our lifetime, we've seen uh, Germany and France, two hardcore enemies, were able to talk their way through an open Schengen policy in Europe, etc. And here we are, even while we talk about Akhand Bharat, etc., we're still, reinforcing and bringing in more machoism into the ideas of borders, etc. At some stage it can get very depressing because when you become aware about a lot of this stuff, you suddenly think, I'm an oppressor, I'm a colonizer myself, or part of a state that is. It is very difficult to deal with, and the book I picked up the book, and it is very heavy. So I'm doing it in bits and pieces, but it is brilliant, and certainly a messaging that needs to be, conversations around this whole idea of enforced borders needs to go out there. Lovely book.
Thank you. But I think for me, it was also realizing that we all write from a very specific positionality. We all write from our privilege. And an important question to ask is also who gets to write about all of these things? Who gets to interpret our social worlds? And I think that also plays an important role. And for someone like me who is the beneficiary of the state, right? I grew up in a very comfortable household, English speaking. The Indian state was in some ways built for someone like you and me. And yet, to speak about, I think it takes a lot of clarity. At least I'll speak about myself. I'm sure there are a lot of people here who are far more educated, far more intuitive than I am. I had to do a lot of unlearning. I had to do a lot of unlearning about my privilege, my prejudices, the language that we use, how does one write about someone, and also the very act of someone like me going into a community means that I come from a position of power, right? And how does one reconcile those differences? And I think those are all important questions. One has to constantly, I don't think there are right or wrong answers, but I think the ethical question of also who gets to write is very important. I think to even define the question of what is oppression, who is the oppressor. And I think those were things that I learned was very important to me.
Yeah, my question will be a couple of mixed. I think you said the history is messy. History is messy. What we learn from schools or colleges, from the history also. The India will be like this, even Kanyakumari to Kashmir, or you can vice versa. But how we can really understand borders? Because once you experience only, you can have a broader perspective of borders. When people do not know, they learn in a way that doesn't look like. But how we can understand, we can accept the fact the borders are not like this. How do we need more literature on that, or how can we explore lot? Because we tend to believe the same. How we can understand? How we get the idea about it. Once we go back, how we can articulate in our own living, how we can educate the upcoming generation. Any answer for that?
I mean, it's always a difficult. I mean, history is very fundamental to nation making. Right? A nation is born out of a certain kind of history making. Who gets to tell the history? And I think that's linked to the thing that I said about who gets to write is very important. I think India has always had a rich vernacular tradition of people writing about different things, of people constantly writing about what it means to belong here. I was recently speaking to someone who said, who was working on the archives on Tamil Nadu's idea of federalism, the local debates. And I realized I didn't know any of this. Not that I assumed that I did, but to educate oneself is a lifelong thing. So I try not to preach. My job as a writer is to write a social reality, is to be honest to this time and speak the truth that I think is important. So multiple things. One, I think, is a larger fundamental problem of who gets to write, who gets to interpret India, or what we think is India, South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Who gets to? It's my very humble opinion that majority of those people still tend to be the same people. India's elite, certain kind of elite, have always interpreted India to the world, not only for us, but also the outside world. Of course, that is increasingly changing. But a certain section of people for the last 70 years have been the ones who have interpreted India, good, bad, or ugly. I think that has to change. Diversity of ideas is important. I think we have to have difficult conversations, difficult ideas. And that's why we have literature. And I think the Indian vernacular traditions have always done a much better job of doing that. So my job is to write. I've written it, but it's also my job to learn. And hopefully people will educate themselves. One can only hope that that process is. I don't like giving speeches. I don't want to preach about it. I think now the biggest problem is the discovery problem. How does one discover something that's different? When algorithms tell us this is what one should do. Discovery of knowledge has always been a question of crisis. And I think that is something that we have to constantly militate. That's why reading different things are important. I read everything. I read everything from Swarajya magazine to Op India to print. I read all kinds of garbage. I also read some good things here and there. But I also try to understand what makes sense for me. So that's how I think about it. So I don't know how to solve this, but I think hopefully if all of us can disagree, I think that's why freedom of expression is so important. The capacity to disagree with each other, the capacity to produce scholarship. I think those are all important. But I don't have great answers. I'm a very small person. I don't have great answers about grand narratives.
This question, you said if you have a collective intelligence, ability, and diversity, we can achieve little bit. But the problem is nowadays the minority views are very important.
What is important?
Minority views. Minority views are important. They're not tend to prevail, but they stimulate divergent attention and thought. But when you dissent something, there's always a backfire. Whether you do or you do not, everything backfires you either by blatant state oppression, anything. But how we can come with this kind of views and challenge this question, have a diverse connotation regarding our own understanding?
I mean, democracy is dissent, right? Well, that is what resistance is. And that's why you write, you think, you speak, you constantly refuse to go down. I was talking about this. My dad's not here. My dad's a huge fan of Jayakanthan, and I've been sitting with him and listening to Bava Challadurai's Kade Neram, where he narrates Jayakanthan's story. There's a line where he says that in a society where everybody is on the floor crawling, the man who is standing up is considered to be arrogant. Our choice is to be, some of us choose to stand, and that's our choice, and some of us choose to face the consequences. Omar Khalid is in prison. Shudha Bharadwaj is outside. Shoma Sen is in prison. Anand Teltumde is in prison. Gautam Navlaka is in prison. We picked up a comedian for a joke that he did not say. All of that is an act of dissent. But dissent and courage have consequences. And I think people have to face it. If you want to live in a democracy, you have to fight for it. Nobody's going to give it to you for free. And if you're not willing to fight for it, I'm not shaming people who don't want to, but I think it's important for us to fight for it. If everybody is going to prostrate, then all we will be is a herd. A lot of us already that in a place where you have to think twice about this. But understand that resistance is the most natural thing. To resist is human. It takes hundreds of years and propaganda and money, buying 88% of this country's media to actually make us all obeying citizens. To disobey, to resist is the most natural. It's like exercise. We just have to keep exercising that muscle of resistance. And I think this state has a long, well-guarded history of resistance. And I think as long as we keep doing it, furthering it, and that job doesn't end, right? This, and I'll say this to in a very interesting way. This Roja Mutaya library is very important place for me because I found out that my grandfather, J.M. Kalyana Sundaram, used to be a printer publisher of Janashakti. Roja Mutaya library has his archives. They published, they printed, they resisted. They won a freedom. Maybe that freedom was not perfect. My parents were children of the emergency generation. They tried, they fought, they did something. Now it's my turn to do something. And every generation has to fight its own battles. And every generation has been oppressed. Every generation has had a state. A state will always try to take more power, will always try to shut you down. Our job as citizens is to constantly be in confrontation with it. The state has to bow down to us, not other way around. So that's what I do. And I know a lot of people in this room do as well. They do it by existing. They do it by fighting. And we keep doing that.
You spoke about the importance of vernacular. One of the interesting debate which happened during the Indian National Press publication was called Adan Pradan series. The idea of this Adan Pradan series is to find in translation. It's called found in translation. And this idea is to understand India through multiple translations. Unfortunately, how much of the translation is reaching out and how much of translation is only within the conversion? As a person who has traveled in this area, how much have you noticed about this interaction?
I think I was very surprised by how politically clear, how well read, at least the vernacular traditions, most people who could read. Second, by the time I was traveling, another thing that is very rich, at least used to be rich in India, was the radio. And by the time I was traveling, vernacular YouTube had become such an important part of local news. And what I realized, and then by the time the book was coming to an end and I was writing, of course, TikTok is now banned. The innovation of the people of the subcontinent is that they are constantly looking for information. They're constantly wanting to engage. They are constantly trying to get knowledge. They might not listen to your NDTVs, they might not read a book, but there is a certain kind of oral tradition where people turn, people do that. In that sense, I think vernacular traditions are very important. And I think it's an English language publication that is very myopic. I think when you write in English, automatically, I think the number of people who you reach becomes very little. You might reach an audience outside of India. And I think that's why translation is important. And people are hungry for things. And people find different ways of finding knowledge. They want to understand what's happening. But that's where the idea of media becomes interesting, is that the same media that they are thirsty for also becomes the way in which it's easy to indoctrinate. And I think the biggest problem now is that increasingly the diversity of ideas, information is what is not reaching. But people are hungry for things. People are constantly aware. People try to understand. That seeking of knowledge is still there. That tradition is still there. I think they haven't completely destroyed that.
The biggest problem today is it's not about the number of media outlets. There is a proliferation of media outlets. The problem is it lacks pluralism. So you have about 500 cameras focusing on a single person rather than getting 3 or 4 viewpoints. I still remember Raghurai landing in Bhopal after the gas tragedy, where he went behind the Union Carbide plant to take some photographs, which means actually you're bringing in an additional perspective. But today, having 500 cameras focusing on the same thing, which means there is a proliferation of information rather than the plurality of information. As a scholar, how do you look at this overwhelming of the proliferation of information, which also gets manifold, it's multiplied in unimaginable way due to algorithm also, where digital algorithm driven manifestation of the proliferation of ideas rather than the plurality of ideas. As a scholar, how do you negotiate this reality?
I think there are two ways. I negotiate it as someone who is a scholar. I also negotiate as someone who's writing, who's photographing. As a scholar, I think we already have the answers. I think if you look at the work of Stuart Hall, what Stuart Hall was talking about, a lot of these people were talking about in the 60s and 70s, thinking about policing dissent. I think the crisis of information or misinformation has been a crisis for a very long time. And I think one of the things that Stuart Hall goes back to over and over again, and something that I think there's value in it for us to think about, is the question of representation. Representation is not so much diversity, but represent. I think we confuse diversity and representation. I think representation is one. One of the things you should consistently do, and I think I do it, and I think that's where the scholar and the writer becomes almost one, is to consistently make sure that, just as I said, that dissent is an act one has to reclaim. Resisting against the one story is also a story that one has to keep constantly fighting, to look for different ways of telling it. And this is why I constantly have a problem with the corporatization of writing. When you have these journalism schools, when you have these MFAs, when you have PhD programs, when you have political scientists, what you're really doing is that you're training a generation of people to write in a very specific way. You're training them to think in a very specific way. You are telling them that this will sell, so you do this. I didn't go through an MFA, and I think writing this book taught me about this very question. Which story does one tell? What source does one quote? All of that is very, very intentional. It is something that one has to constantly keep doing over and over again. Initially, when I started writing this book, I remember looking at my reading list. It was all English, written by men of a certain class and caste, with very specific view. And I realized that this was what was very easily accessible to me because it agreed with my idea of the world. It agreed with everything that I wanted to say. One of the reasons it took me 8 years to write this book, and that's why I said I also had to unlearn a lot of this, is to look for a diversity of bibliography. Citation is politics. Who you cite is politics. Who you choose to listen to is politics. What map you choose to give is politics. How you get to take a photograph is politics. Who you tend to dedicate your book to is politics. You realize very quickly how powerful open words. And this is something that I constantly tell myself that I have to keep looking for. That plurality is very important because it's very easy for all of us to get caught in our bubbles of indifference, thinking it's a bubble of hope, right? When I speak to someone like you, it gives me great hope because I know that a lot of things that I think are things that you believe in. If I believe that freedom of speech is important, I believe that you will also believe that. But sometimes that bubble of hope that we are all creating for ourselves also becomes a bubble of indifference where we can also become that I only will cite Mr. Paneer Selvam when I think about this. When I ask him about a very specific question, the complacency begins. And that is something that we constantly have to, that's also a part of a muscle that one has to flex. There are no right answers, right? Because we are in the business of interpreting the world. We are in the world of thinking about social realities. And that's always going to be. And the second part of it is reserving the right to change your mind. I always reserve the right. And I don't think of it as a flaw. I think it's a great value because that's how our citations, our politics, who we refer to, who we listen to, all of that matters.
One last question. This is, you are also a photographer. How do you make this distinction between what is an empathetic look and what is a voyeuristic gaze? Where does an empathetic look becomes a voyeuristic gaze? As a photographer, how do you draw that line?
This is a very long answer. So see, I became a photographer because I don't know why I became a photographer. I've been taking photographs since 2004. I became a photographer because I was very afraid of being a writer. I didn't think I could be a good writer. I've always wanted to be a writer, but I was very afraid to be a writer. So I thought I'll become a photographer. Also, my grandfather was a photographer. I felt visual language was easy for me. And when I became a photographer, what do most photographers do? We look at the grades. We go to the Magnum archive. We look at, Cartier-Bresson. Everybody here who's taken a camera at one point in time has quoted Bresson, and we've said, these moments. We were all quoted Kappa saying, if you're not close enough, you're not good enough. But when Kappa was photographing, there was no, there's only a fixed lens. There was no telephoto lens, right? And then and I did all those idiocies because I felt that I was already told that these were the masters and you photograph like them. It took me a long time to realize that the traditions that these great masters came from, or the masters, I no longer think of them as great masters, is a very different tradition from mine. My photographic, impulse should be intuitive to who I am. What is it that I am photographing? And that took a long time for me. And now there is a reason I'm saying this is because now there's a big debate happening within the Magnum archives because a lot of young photographers, especially photographers from a lot of brown and black photographers, are now challenging the Magnum archive because the Magnum archive has violent images of rape. Every year in the world press for the last 10 years, we know photographers who have photographed young children being raped. They've indulged in some very unethical practices that are being challenged. So for me, I really had to go back and tell myself, and that's what Afghanistan did for me, is that you will not see any of my images before Afghanistan because I don't think those images are worthy. They are stunning images. I've won awards for them. I stopped submitting my images for awards and I stopped taking photographs like that because I no longer wanted to photograph like the masters. It took me a long time to realize what I wanted to photograph. Second, I think empathy and ethics are important. My friend Ritesh Chandani was another brilliant photographer. Once said that, the elusive difference between, the difference between a photographer and the subject, the camera lens, that distance is so elusive. It's already so powerful. The distance, you can never bridge the distance. So what can you do? What can you do is have clarity about what is it that you're photographing, why are you photographing it, and why should this photograph be a part of the archive? And that's why even in the book, I very meticulously document moments in which I did mistakes. There is a moment in the India-Bangladesh border where I want to take a photograph. And this gentleman next to me says, please don't take this photograph. Let these kids' images not become an archive of violence. Let them just be. At that moment, I put my camera down. And I said, you know what? That's right. Why am I photographing this? Because that moment looked great. There were purple flowers, a border fence that was PK, lush greenery, young kids with a kite. What a remarkable moment. Remarkable moment of a kite flying across the border. These kids are flying it, the kite is flying. You can see the fence. It's green, lush. There are purple flowers blooming. What a stunning image. That's the moment. But you don't have to document that moment. What does that moment tell me? Nothing. It gives, I'm stealing someone's moment, but what does that moment tell me? So for me, letting go of that was also part of my way of thinking. I also don't use the word photographic practice because it seems not in touch. Photography is not a practice. As a writer, I'm trying to document the world. I'm going to use every tool that I have. And I think of photography has different rules. Sometimes it can be an ad memoir, sometimes it can be an act of witness, sometimes it can be an act of joy. But any moment that there is no consent, I think that is a moment when it becomes wrong. There is a photograph of Rohingya refugees sleeping. The woman is sleeping with the pallu slightly off. The kid is naked, lying down. The man is exhausted from walking for 16 hours. And the Guardian photographer takes a photograph from the top. And that photograph made me very angry because what if it was me? Would I allow someone, if I was a refugee, if tomorrow I was driven away from my home and I got 16 hours with my little child, I do have a 5-year-old daughter, and we were exhausted. My clothes, my sari is torn, and I'm lying down in exhaustion. How would I feel to have this man stand on top of me and take a photograph? What story is he telling that has not been told before? That story does not need to be told when it's being told at the cost of someone's life. I will not rob another human being's life. That is my life. That's always been my life. And it took me a while to come to that line because, like everybody else, I also thought that a great photographer's job is to take that one stunning image and then have an exhibition in ICP in New York where people would come, look at that image, drink champagne, and tell me, Suchitra, you've done it. I wanted all of those things 15 years ago. I would have loved for that. Now that just doesn't seem important to me. Now what is important to me is, am I able to tell the social reality in front of me? Am I able to tell it in the most ethical, dignified way? And in that process, am I being a decent human being and am I not robbing the other person? So this is how I think of that one photograph that I would put out.
Last question.
I'm Karthik. I just really like the line in the book. I just remember, like, just like Myanmar, India is also exporting foreigners from its own citizens. It's happening all over the border. How was it easier for you to document all these things? Because I have read the Bhavan Singh's version, and we see numerous prime ministers, governors, and you have also written about judges who are given extra opportunities when they deport more people. Where are we heading exactly?
Where are we heading?
Exactly. Where is so-called this governance heading exactly?
I think it's going to be a very difficult 2 years. In 2014, 2013, I wrote an essay where I said, I think the science of balkanization. I understand balkanization because that's where I cut my field as a lawyer. I worked for the Tribunal of Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and I understand what happens to a community that is being primed for destruction. As early as 2013, even as I started this book, I felt that as a community, as a series of, I think of India as a federation of communities. We are many different communities tied together by, I think there are many different communities struggling to all live within this territorial community. I think the next few years are going to be very difficult. In our lifetime, the India that you and I were born into is going to rapidly transform. The erosion of citizenship rights is already here. We've seen that in CAA, NRC. We see it every single day, whether it is the linking of Aadhaar with voter IDs. So it's not just the direct stripping, it's also the ways in which the state continues to assert more and more and more rights. Along with it, we are seeing a consistent destruction of institutions. Today, we say, oh, people are not speaking up. What happens to people who speak up? It's not because people are not courageous. This country has some of the most courageous people, but no nation should demand such courage from its people. The problem is not that we do not have courageous people in this country, but 20 years ago, maybe if somebody courageous spoke up, they would not be picked up and thrown into prison for so long. Maybe there would be some kind of judicial review. The institutions are gone. Political leadership, as we understand, is no longer political leadership that thinks that the people in this country deserve to. Every single day, we see violence against minorities, and that violence is very quickly going to come to us. And what is the Hindu Rashtra? There can only be one kind of Hindu, one kind of a nation, one kind of a language. So where do people like us fit into that? So I think we are headed towards some of the most turbulent years, which will also see the very rapid destruction of a republic that was built through a lot of violence, but also a lot of sacrifice. I do believe that there will be those who will fight for it. When I say fight for it, I do not know if we're going to fight for the idea of India, because we can't go back to the status quo. I think we have to fight for something better. We have to fight for this radical idea that everybody, that we can do better. That fight is going to be long. Chances are we might not win that fight, but nonetheless, it's a fight that one has to win. But I do believe that the next 20 to 30 years is going to be very, very good. And I do not think in those years, what will be left will be the India that you and I want. I don't, it's not my intent to be scary, but I think that is where we are. I think he might be the much better person to answer that question. I will tell you something else. You always there's a wonderful book by Mariam Kaba. That's the title. It's about abolitionist movement. The title is called "We Do This Till It Frees Us." Freedom is always going to be taken away from us. So we do this till it frees us. So we have to keep doing this in our life. I believe that we have to fight for the person next to us. There might be a cancer, but who is the cancer killing? You have to be able to fight for the person who is being attacked today. Not because of any great ideal. I think that's the most decent thing to do. So you fight. You always fight. You never give up. But the question is, what do you fight for? Do you fight for an idea of a nation? Or do you fight for the idea that the person next to you should have the same dignity, respect, and freedom that you have, or what we might no longer have? I think that fight is a fight that you and I have. It's a fight that we will pass on to our children's children, and that fight is always going to be. So you do this till it frees us. So we keep doing it. Not everybody can do it, but those of them who do it will. And I see myself as a football. My job is to record those who fight. I'm not brave. I don't know if I'm brave. I'm not the one. Khalid is in prison. I'm not. Sharjeel is in prison. I'm not Sharjeel. Toma Sen is in prison. Anand Teltumde is in prison. Puram Parvez is in prison. I am not those brave people. I am outside. I'm sitting here. So what can I do? My job is to then be the footnote of history, to record that, to always make sure that Umar Khalid is remembered. Not that because I write, remembering is an act of community. That's what I'm saying. What anybody else does is for you to decide. Resistance can happen in every act. Like breathing is resistance. So don't get it off. That's what I think.
Democratic earning is being ingrained in us. I don't think anybody is going to take it away. For instance, when General Sia established this military group, some of the Pakistani generals said that, look, we have 3 years. Allah, Amin, America. But these 3 years are not going to reduce us to subsequent human beings. We'll fight for our rights. Imagine to say it at a time when we were getting the maximum support with Afghanistan, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And this was the statement which was there. Hence, I think that democratic earning is much more deeply ingrained than what we have been to acknowledge. And it's far more difficult. And the power of this diffuse democratic earning is the one which is going to protect us. I don't know if it's my belief or it's my delusion, but nonetheless, that's where I come from. And thank you for coming.
I know it's a Monday evening, so thanks for coming. This, as I said, is very special to me. This is my first public event. I hope all of you will stay safe, wear masks, and we also have books. That's what my publisher told me to say. We have books. If you want the books here, and I'm happy to sign it for you. But again, thank you so much for coming and listening to me. Thank you. I really appreciate it.